be intentional. That everything we do, right, in the time that we have, the resources that we have, that we are here and we are called to intentional living. We have a purpose as God's ambassadors, as His ombudsman, right? The only way that His truth will be told is through us. He could choose donkeys, rocks, and anything else, but He chose us to deliver His message.
Yes, He chose us to deliver His message, and that is a sobering perspective and an accurate one. And on this episode of the Pathway to Purpose podcast, Pat Gelsinger is going to lay out some clear disciplines of the Christian faith for business leaders to help propel that message with integrity and clarity. And not just through our words, but through our lives and our actions as leaders. Pat delivered this message at an FCCI conference many years ago, and we're excited to be coming up on this year's conference in Lake Tahoe. You don't want to miss the messages of encouragement and equipping in Christian leadership and business practice that will be delivered during the 2024 conference from speakers such as Donald Miller of StoryBrand, Jordan Rayner, whose books and podcasts are so impactful in the faith and work movement today, and many other speakers at the conference you just don't want to miss in person. Register at conference.fcci.org and make sure you're part of these transforming days, September 15 through 18 at the Everline Resort in Lake Tahoe. Well, let's hear from Pat Gelsinger as he reminds us about spiritual disciplines, mentorship, navigating corporate politics, business struggles, and balancing the many arenas of life for the glory of God.
So now that I know that what my job is, I'm called to be this workplace minister, right? And I'm now working full-time, going to school full-time, right? Have a family full-time, this new faith full-time. How do you make it all fit? And out of that, right, I came, to this period in my life where I was just so struggling, right? And, every project that you do, right? How many trips to the hardware store do you do for a project, Bill? Yeah, you don't do it? Okay, don't do it anymore. So every project, right, you make 3 trips to the hardware store, right? If you're going to do, right, a building project, you make a plan, right? You figure it out what you're going to go do, right? If you're going to do everything in life, we make a plan for, right? What we're going to do. You go to college, you want to make know what you're going to do. You want to retire, you make a plan for it. You figure it all out. But do we make a plan for life? What's your most important resource? What's the one resource you can't get any more of? And do you have a plan for your time? And I was 32 years old, right? And I was, had accomplished lots of my unwritten goals. I became a vice president for Intel when I was 31. I had written my first book. How many of you read my first book? Yeah, really? Programming the 8386? Terrence, man, I love you, brother. Woo! You get to the last chapter when you turn paging mode on. Yeah, it's really. I wrote a book. I had my first patent. I was an inventor. I finished my first chip. And all of a sudden, I got to this point in life where I finished all my goals. Right? And I got, am I done when I'm 32 years old? And out of that came this period of deep soul searching, right, for me to say, what am I going to do with the rest of my life, right? And out of that came this period of developing a mission statement, deciding what I wanted to do. And I will argue that every one of us should have a clear view of what we want to do with the rest of our life. And as I read through the scriptures, you come to Paul, right, in Philippians, 3:13 and 14. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which Christ has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Do you think Paul had a plan? Do you think he had goals he was out straining for, reaching for, driving to accomplish? You read in Galatians, you read in 1 Corinthians, right, a story, right, the race, the prize, as he buffeted his body, right, out to bring more currency into heaven than anything else that he was going to do for his life. And so the question is, do you have a plan for life? Right, and with it, these are some of the things, I think everyone should have a mission statement, sort of saying, what you want your epitaph to read, right, when you leave this earth, and this happens to be mine, right, to use every resource right? When I leave this earth, I don't want a penny left in the bank account, right? And I don't want an ounce of energy left in this body, right? I want it all used up, right, as I cross over. A good friend of ours, Bill Jessup, his son, Bryce, was the man who married us. He preached, he sat down, and he died. And it's like, to me, that's about as good as it gets, right? To be doing work, right, and finish and go straight on to eternity. And I guess that's what my goal would be. And then I think values, sort of your guardrails. These are the things that, people are going to know when they say, what's Pat Gelsinger, right? What's Terrence? These are the things that are going to say, this is how I'm going to live and how I want people to recognize me. And then finally, some specific goals, things that you want to accomplish and get done. Now, these are mine, right? The question is, do you have yours figured out? Some can be simple, some can be hard, some can be long-term, some can be short-term. I think they have to cover all areas of life, right? What you're doing with your family, what you're doing with your person, what you're doing with your career, right? What you're doing with your spouse. Some are aspirational. You may never achieve them. Some, right, very near-term and specific. And obviously, you see I had a few edits there. I thought I was going to be president of Intel when I wrote them, right, over 20 years ago, so I had to edit that a few times, right? But something to keep driving me forward, to make me better along the way. You draft them, you put them in the drawer, you come back to them later, you rework them. I think that should be good for, the epics of life that you're in. And I think now, as Linda and I are coming into grandparenting and this new role, it's about time for us to spend more time and think about this next phase of our journey, right, as we go forward. And obviously, these become things that you then sort of measure, right? Am I doing what I said that I would do with the rest of my life? Now, personally, I come and grade these every year, right? I add up, right? Look how, I usually do it at tax time because I already have all the tax information, the financial information available. I'm already depressed about taxes, so it's a good time, right, to go grade them that way. That was funny. You're supposed to laugh. You're already depressed at taxes, right? But do you have a plan for the rest of your life? Second, I would challenge you with is some help along the way. Now, we as men, right, we didn't get the social gene, most of us, right? And our wives got almost all of that, so I know that I'm sort of brain dead that way. I'm only logical, right, and so on. But, women get together and talk about things so easily, and we men, well, it's a little bit harder for us. A number of years ago, I had just presented to the executive staff of Intel. Right, and I had given this presentation, and it was at the end of the 386 project, and and in the audience were the legends of the semiconductor industry. Robert Noyce, right, the inventor of the transistor. Well, that's pretty cool. Gordon Moore, the guy who wrote Moore's Law, the defining premise of the industry. Andy Grove, president, Time Magazine, Man of the Year. These incredible people, and then dweeb me was presenting to them. Right, and I had some very tough messages to deliver to them and things they had to go do if I was going to get my chip done. Well, finished the presentation. A couple of days later, I'm sitting in my office and the phone rings. And, I was just so focused on what I was doing. I had no interest at all in, being interrupted, but finally the phone keeps ringing, so I pick it up. Who is it? Andy. Andy who? The voice comes back, Andy Grove. This is the president, the founder of the company. I'm dweeb, and he's way up here. I was just incredible, right? Frightened. And he starts asking me questions. What do you read? What are you studying? What's your career objectives? What you going to do next? Just starts shelling me with questions. And I was barely able to talk. So, and he says, those are lousy answers. Right? And he says, those are lousy answers. Be in my office in a week with better ones. So if the president says to be in his office in a week and with better answers, what do you say? You either leave the country or you show up, right? It's pretty simple. And that began a mentoring relationship that continues literally to this day, right? And if you're going to have a mentor in the IT industry, Andy Grove's not a bad choice, but he's tough, right? Having a mentoring session with Andy Grove is like going to the dentist and not getting Novocaine, right? Right? He just probes and he drives and he's making you better. And it's highly spiritual as well. Ecclesiastes 4, 9-12, and just finishing, right? If two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. Right? And I believe all of us need to have these mentoring relationships deep into our life. Right? You need a Paul, somebody who's pouring into you, a Barnabas, a buddy along the way. and a Timothy, somebody that you're pouring into their life, some help along the way. As I came, today I have a mentor, Steve, who's a retired CEO from the high-tech industry. We talk every Friday, and he's keeping me accountable along the way. Part of the reason I was excited to come to EMC was Joe was a CEO coach for me, right? And it was fun. The board, I meet with the board members regularly at EMC over the last several years, and one of them said to me, he says, 2 things you got to work on, Pat. So one of the board members says 2 things. Your ears are perked up, right? And he says, one is you need to dress like an executive. Okay, I can do that, right? Linda, help me. Let's go to Nordstrom's. We'll get this worked out. And the second one is, he says, you need to know more about corporate finance. Okay, we can work on that. Joe got me a personal coach, a Columbia University professor who taught me Corporate Finance 101. Right, so, I had my own private Columbia professor teaching me corporate finance, right, making me better along the way. Now, of course, Linda thought I was only slightly odd when I carted along the 1,100-page textbook of corporate finance on our summer vacation through the Nordics and the Baltics last year. I thoroughly enjoyed it, out there reading on the deck, right, reading corporate finance. So anyway, now you get to know me a little bit more, but it was good. People who are making you better along the way, right, and people that you're pouring into their life, and people who are still driving you to be better. So do you have a mission statement? Do you have mentors? As I begin this next phase of my life, maturity, I've heard it said, is learning the lessons that you thought you already knew. I thought, that's pretty good. So the next things I wanted to talk about are things you already know. And the question is, are you doing them? Right? And the things I already know. But the question is, am I doing them? And as I enter this next phase of my life, right, I call it a spiritual rhythm. How many of you are brand new Christians? How many of you are Christians for more than 10 years? Almost all of us. And the question is, how do we keep running the race? Right, as we go into, it's no longer fresh and new. You've been doing this for decades. And how do you keep that same rhythm? Right, of keeping your spiritual health. First, what I'd say is, how do we keep putting God on the throne every day of our life? If there is one person in all of Scripture, if there's just one that any businessman should read and study, it would be Daniel. In fact, if I had the talk to do over again, I would just probably talk about Daniel. He is just such a phenomenal guy. Remember, he came to second in power under 3 different kingdoms. Can you believe that? That's like, he became, first the prime minister in the UK. He came and became president in the vice president of the United States. And then he went and became a premier in China. Right? You talk about an accomplished individual under 3 different regimes. Daniel rose to number 2. That's pretty impressive, don't you think? Right, of all the major figures in Scripture, there's only one who has no sin listed of his life, and that's Daniel. Every other one, right, you have some listing of sin. This guy is a guy to look at. My prayer partner, Gregory, he prays every week when we're on the phone. He always ends his prayer, God, may Pat be like Daniel. And if you want to study just one person, right, study Daniel. In Daniel 6:3, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities. Daniel 6:4, they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent in anything he did. How many of you have ever seen politics in the workplace? I have this little phrase. I say, where 2 or more are gathered, there will be politics. Right? Right, and Daniel gets shanghaied with some of the worst corporate politics that have ever gone on. Right? And his character shone through. Each of us have been ordained to our roles. And may we be like Daniel, because what did he do when the law was passed? He went and bowed down and prayed, just like he had every other day 3 times. So the question is, are we putting God on the throne of our lives every day? Second is, time is your tool, not your curse. How many of you feel, right, under this incredible burden of your calendar? right? It is just a frightening thing some days, right? Meetings after meetings, people demanding, right? But the question is, are you using time or is time cursing you? And have you decided to take your time and make it your strategic ally for the purposes that you believe God has called you to? You are here in this audience today because you are people of resource. You are people of capability, of success. That's why you're here. You want to show up for a conference like this. Right? And the question is, are you using your most precious resource to drive the kingdom forward in powerful ways? Make time your tool, not your curse. This has been an incredible 3 years for Linda and I. And I wish I could stand up here and say that I have been the perfect husband for those 3 years. You get in a new job, and what do? It's like, you're on the steep learning curve. Everything is new, and you're so consumed, and right, you got to succeed, right? After 30 years at Intel, I can't fail, can I? Right? You're working hard, aggressively, and all this kind of stuff, right? And of course, right, in that, I'm the most pleasant, supportive, thoughtful husband on the face of the earth. Yeah, fat chance. And after 30 years, Linda and I just celebrated our 30-year anniversary on August 7th. And we came, Walt and Patty, wherever you guys are, we came to your session today just for some reminders, so it was good. But it's been a lot of pressure the last 3 years, right, for us. I asked her to move from Oregon to Boston, right? And then literally, we had been talking about this potential change of me going over to VMware. The day that Paul, Joe, the CEO, and myself agreed to this change was the day that Linda signed the last check for our house remodel in Boston, the very day. Can you believe that? Right? And of course, I came home to Linda and says, we made the decision to do the swap, and she looks at me just cold-faced and she says, so you're killing my project. That's speaking as an engineer could speak, right? You killed my project. So, empty nesting and so on, and I just need to say, Linda, I cherish you. And I thank you for 30 years, and I pray that God will give us 30 more years together. And I pray that in my spiritual rhythm, that I can keep putting you right on the throne of my affections and life every day as we go through this next phase of our journey together. And finally, we are men and women under accountability. Right? And even as CEO, I'm accountable to the board of directors and to our investors. In high-tech firms, they have this great reputation, right, for having CEOs that go off the deep end, right? We got, Larry Ellison's and, Bill Gates and, all these wild and crazy figures, right, from our industry. We got people like Bob Moffett and the Galleon scandals that you might be familiar with, right, and I need to continue to be, right, a person of accountability, just like every one of you do. People holding us accountable to the call that we have been brought forward with. And I have my mentor, Steve, weekly, right? Just saying, how are you doing, Pat? Right? How are you doing in those areas that we're talking about? We recently started mentoring a new guy, Wayne, right? And I'll tell you what, right? In 2 months of mentoring with Wayne, right, his spiritual life, right, and now it's just exploding again. And it is just the most powerful thing, right, to have mentoring, accountability, and people in your life who are saying, through relationships, just like FCCI does, right, that we're going to commit to individual relationships, men and women holding each other accountable. And finally, I'd say all of these brought together is if I could summarize tonight in one word, it would just be intentional. That everything we do, right, in the time that we have, the resources that we have, right, that we are here and we are called to intentional living. We have a purpose as God's ambassadors, as His ombudsman, right? The only way that His truth will be told is through us. He could choose donkeys, rocks, and anything else, but He chose us to deliver His message. A number of weeks ago, I received this email. It says, "You were the main example used by our couples retreat speaker talking about the Psalm 128 man." Now, when you get a mail like that, what do you do next? You look up Psalm 128, right? So it's real simple. And Psalm 128, 1 through 6, "Blessed are all who fear the Lord, who walk in his ways. You will eat the fruit of your labor. Blessings and prosperities will be yours. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your sons will be like olive shoots around your table. This is the man blessed who fears the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion all the days of your life. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem, and may you live to see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel." What a great summary of a life well lived. The fruit of your labor, blessings and prosperity, a wife bearing fruit in her household, grandchildren, and prosperity in your land. And I pray for each one of you that you too would be Psalm 128 men and women. Thank you.
Wow, to be a Psalm 128 leader in our society today, wouldn't that transform culture for the glory of God? As Pat mentioned, the value of being in mentoring relationships and being held accountable in this journey of faith. Well, how are you doing? FCCI would be honored to serve you in the desire to come alongside and encourage your Christian faith as a leader, a business owner, through our groups, our curriculum, devotionals, events, business coaching, and the international conference that I mentioned earlier in the podcast. Reach out to us through our website at fcci.org, and we'll look forward to partnering with you on this journey. Thanks for listening today, and may you be encouraged as you continue in your calling to lead a company for Christ.